step back into the world of Joshua. Okay, again, we're talking 3,400 years ago. The other side of the world, completely different cultural context, completely different world circumstances that was going on at that time. Joshua has been the selected one to step into the position of leading Israel, where Moses had done so much in bringing them out of Egyptian captivity and so forth. Joshua is the one that leads them into the promised land. All of the different events that have come to pass. The land has now been divided. There have been some particular things that we have looked at that the book has recorded for us, the Levitical cities, the cities of refuge, and so forth. Chapter 23 and 4, as the book closes, are really kind of what we would call today, I suppose, the swan song of Joshua. It comes to the final instructions portion, everything that goes with it. It gives us kind of an interesting chronological thing right off the bat as chapter 23 opens. It tells us that it came to pass a long time after that the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua waxed old and stricken in age. As you go to chapter 24, you find Joshua dies at being 110 years old. Okay? We do not know for certain the age of Caleb or Joshua, either one. I pick out those two because those were the two that would have been men at the time of the Kadesh Barnea incident that predated entering the promised land by 40 years of Israel's wanderings in the wilderness, right? Okay. To go in on that expedition, they did not go look for teenagers or junior hires. Okay, but we assume that Joshua and Caleb, the two that were obedient to God by faith, were probably in their early 20s. Again, we don't specifically know if there was an age difference between. Some have suggested that Caleb was noticeably older than Joshua. We have no way to determine that, really. You can speculate and come up with theories, but to put your finger dogmatically on a book, chapter, and verse and say, see right here, it proves, good luck with that, because I haven't been able to find it. We do know that right after the conquest, the northern and southern conquest of the land, that Caleb made that statement that he getting ready to go in and take the mountain of the Anakim, as his posterity and inheritance. He said he was 85 years old. Okay? And so if you begin backdating stuff, then you find 38 and a half years wandering in the wilderness, 7 to 8 years of wandering or of fighting battles within the land. So you take that off, and it would seem that Caleb very likely would have been somewhat older than Joshua. Okay? How does that help us? Not specifically at all when it comes to the age of Joshua, because we don't know when Caleb died. It does, however, paint an interesting picture that if Joshua was a wet behind the ears 21, 2, or 3-year-old representing Israel going in to spy out the land, that very likely Caleb would have been in his early 40s. So you have kind of an interesting relationship that could have developed there. In any case, having said that, then when it turns out it's Joshua that takes the leadership of the nation, the young man takes the leadership of the nation, not the older man. Because we don't know, as chapter 23 opens here, it says a long time after. So we don't know for certain how much time passed between the land at rest following the division of the land for the inheritance of the tribes, etc., etc. We're not sure how much time that passed until Joshua dies at 110 at the end of chapter 24. Okay? So If you're really concerned about how important this is, go talk to somebody else, because I really don't see it as that important. Otherwise, God would have probably recorded it for us. It does, however, bring up some interesting relational possibilities as far as age groups and, older serving the younger, younger serving the older, vice versa, role reversal upon God's calling and so forth. Uh, but we find then that the end of Joshua's life has approached in verses 1 and 2, and Joshua, it says, calls for Israel and their elders and their heads, that talk about the heads of the clans, heads of the tribes, heads of the families, and for their judges, those of you guys that have been teaching Sunday school in the book of Judges. Okay, this is the pre-runner, okay, of the era of the judges that God is already using during the end of Joshua's life, judges, men, godly men in the different areas around the promised land to take care of civil matters for all practical purposes. I'll just lump it that way. Now, so this is almost a precursor. It's kind of the initial stage of then flowing into the 300 years that we call the period of Judges, recorded in the very next book that in our English Bibles follows the book of Joshua. Okay? And this is what he says to them. And now what you have here in chapter 23 is the same thing said 3 times. How's that? Okay? The same basic content. Joshua is going to try to get his point across to the leadership of the nation of Israel. And he's going to go at it, and then he's going to turn right around and do it again, and then he's going to turn right around and do it the 3rd time. The terminology is a little bit different, and a couple of the emphasis, are in this time and not in that, and vice versa. But I think you'll see what I mean. He says to them in verse 3, "You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these peoples because of you, for the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you. Behold, I have divided unto you by lot these peoples, the nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off, even to the great sea westward." That's the Mediterranean. "And the Lord your God, he will expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight. You will possess their land as the Lord your God hath promised for you. Be ye therefore very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that you turn not aside from there to the right or the left, that you come not among these peoples, that these that remain among you neither make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, neither serve them, nor bow yourselves to them, but cleave to the Lord your God as you have done unto this day." Okay, what are the main things there?
God did it.
God did it. Joshua draws the attention of the nation that it was God who delivered the promised land for them. True, they had to do their part on a human basis, but it was God, it was his plan and his deliverance. What else do you see?
Be courageous, be obedient,
Okay.
and stay away from those other people.
Yeah.
Be faithful to God.
Okay, and I'll split that a little bit. If you go clear back to the beginning of the book, somebody read chapter 1, verse 9. That is the beginning of the book. Now, go ahead, read that verse for us, whoever finds that.
"Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest."
Okay, and it goes on and talks about keep the commandments of God. That must have really stuck in Joshua's mind, because that command was given years and years and years before. Okay? If he was indeed more or less Caleb's age even, then he would have been in his early 40s when he came into the promised land, and then he fought for years and years getting there, and then now is stricken in old age. We're talking about decades And his charge to the Jewish nation is almost the same thing that God had charged him with way back when God gave him the job. God's rules don't change. And I'm going to suggest to you, that's cool. Yeah, because in this case, he is calling to the leadership. It's the leadership text in one emphasis. And he's saying, if you're going to take charge, if you're going to be in one of these leadership roles to govern wisely and righteously God's people, then the same command goes now as them. Okay? God doesn't change. Men may play games with God's word and God's command, but God doesn't change. And his call to be courageous, stand fast, honor God with his life is the same. And that's what Joshua is emphasizing, passing on. Now, the one big negative, and Kent mentioned this here, is stay away from the foreign gods. Now, they were supposed to, you remember, we're all well familiar with it by now. I've beat you over the head with it for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. You know, Israel really messed up when they would not follow through and drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Kenathite, and all the ites and oats and outs and all the other guys. You should get rid of them because it had nothing to do with their economics. Didn't really have anything to do in and of itself with anything except how much influence idolatry would have eventually as it crept into the life of Israel. Okay? Wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I got a question.
Uh-huh.
When Israel is giving parts of the land away today to the Palestinians, is that
Stupid? Yeah.
well? But doesn't that directly go against what God told
They're going contrary to because God gave that land to Israel, and in its ultimate, as far as the chronology of things, in the ultimate sense, that is their everlasting possession. And again, they've never possessed the entire land, even under King David or Solomon. They did not possess everything described in Genesis 15. But when they began bartering land for peace, that's a recipe for disaster. Because what we call the Palestinian group, the Arab nations, it goes clear back to Ishmael. Okay, we're going back a long time. And the Arab concept of peace in the Middle East is to exterminate the nation of Israel. So any other thing that comes up, any other ploy, political, economic, military that happens to arise, it's all being utilized by the anti-God forces to wipe out the Jewish nation. Okay? That's their ultimate goal. So Israel bowing down to pressure from the United Nations or whatever to peel off a little chunk and give the Gaza Strip back to the PLO and to Yasser Arafat, one of the biggest butchers, in modern times of innocent women and children, for the sake of peace in the Mideast. Well, that hasn't worked out real good, has it? What's it been now, 40 years or something like that since the Gaza Strip thing? That hasn't worked out. That was that Menachem Begin or even before him? Anyway, we won't get into that. Okay. The danger invariably is not the initial decade. Okay? The initial decade of occupation is not the problem. You see this as the book of Judges begins. Israel followed God all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, that had seen all of the great things that God had done when he gave them the land. Okay? But what happens? Complacency, compromise. Okay? They did not drive out all the peoples, the idolatrous aspects. Okay? See, pretty soon your grandkids that are teenagers go to the county fair. And one of the booths that's down there is a Jebusite, absolute hot piece of young woman. I mean, she's just oozing hormones out of everything. And this young Jewish kid, he's walking on his tongue back and forth in front of the stand for the entire fair. Well, pretty soon, I mean, there's, the little barn dance on the side and sneaking out and this and that. Well, pretty soon, now you got half Jewish, half Jebusite little babies. And to keep peace in the family, after all, they're your grandkids, right? You don't want to exclude them from the family reunions. And as the decades turn into 2 or 3 or 4 generations, pretty soon you've got all kinds of idolatrous stuff that this delightful young woman in and of herself, with those cute little cuddly grandkids. But with that came the idolatrous influence of the Jebusite worship system. And over a period of generations, that's what God is saying here, and that's what Joshua is trying to drive home. And don't go there. Okay? I mean, he really emphasizes that. Now, verse 9, he picks right back up and says, for the Lord has driven out from before you great peoples. King James is nation. It's ethnos. It's in the Hebrew or the Greek, either one. It means people groups. We'd think them as ethnic groups today. He says, they were great and strong, but as for you, no man has been able to stand before you unto this day. Once again, God has been doing this. He says, remember, God is the one who gave you this whole land. 1 man of you will chase 1,000, for the Lord your God is he that fights for you, as he has promised you. Take good heed, therefore. Now you get back to the charge. It's repetitive, like I said. Unto yourselves that you love the Lord your God. First things first. Focus on God. Else. You ready for the else? That little but word in there, you could put but. Well, this one is else. This is a 4-letter word. If you do in any wise go back and cleave to the remnant of these people groups, even these that remain among you, and will make marriages with them and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that, number 1, the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these people from in front of you. God's going to just walk away from it, okay? Number 2, they will be snares and traps to you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes. Ouch. Number 3, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. Israel, as we know from our history books, has had a checkered history when it comes to remaining in the land. They're captive, they're thrown out, they're captive, they're thrown out, they're captive, they're thrown out, dispersion here, exile there, chased around the world, brought back, thrown back out. Could happen again, by the way. There's no guarantee that it won't before the Lord's return. So keep in mind. You see how this is working? It's Tim, I think, as well as maybe the other guys, brought out the cyclic nature of the book of Judges. Okay, I know Kent emphasized, probably all you guys that have taught through that. It's how Israel is flying high because God is fighting for them and they're focused on the Lord, and then they settle into complacency because everything is going just fine, and they put their feet up and enjoy the abundance of life, and pretty soon a little bit of idolatry and a little bit of compromise comes sneaking in, and then they fall into open sin, and then they crash and burn, captivity, and in no time at all, then what have they got to look forward to? Well, now they're in bondage, and eventually, I say eventually, human nature being what it is, and Israel being very hard-necked when it comes to repentance, as a people, they finally cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, and the whole delivery cycle and the whole thing repeats itself. Joshua here goes on in verse 14, says, Behold, This day I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your soul, not one thing has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God spoke concerning you. God is faithful. God has fulfilled his part of the bargain. All are come to pass to you, not one thing has failed. Therefore, it shall come to pass, that as all good things are come upon you, which the Lord your God promised, so shall the Lord bring upon you the evil things. Evil from the sense of calamity. That's really sometimes a better way to understand that Old Testament word for evil. Until he has destroyed you. That's not annihilate. It means to mar to the point of bringing into a worsened state. Okay? You're driving around being chauffeured in your Rolls Royce one day, and the next day you are pushing a 40-year-old Volkswagen with 2 flat tires because circumstances have changed. Okay? God has brought you into a worsened state. He has destroyed you. That's the way the term is used. Not annihilated from the sense of killed everybody. No, that's not what it means. He's destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. He's talking about that God will see that they are exiled and dispersed and taken into captivity into foreign lands. Daniel just happened to be one of those as something that came to mind. When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and, ready for it? Surprise, served other gods. Right there in the middle of verse 16. And bowed yourself to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given to you. You're not going to be here anymore. God's going to put you into captivity. God's going to exile you. God's going to cause all kinds of harm, damage, and bad times to come upon the nation because, as it's put in other places, they go a-whoring after other gods. Joanna?
It says here that happened 800 years later when they were exiled.
It's happened and happened.
And all the things
Yeah.
that happened in the meantime.
In the meantime. And God, in his long suffering, put up with all kinds of stuff from Israel. But you do reap what you sow. That's, it is a universal principle, even from a physical thing. Yes, Ken?
Just like Moses, Joshua doesn't say if, he says when.
When? Yeah. And because, of course, God's omniscience and being eternal makes it a little easier for him to say, I know this is going to happen. But the reason it's going to happen is not because I know it. The reason it's going to happen is you are going to violate the commandments I gave you. In doing so, as a righteous God, I can no longer reward you for disobedience. America is really funny that way. Funny from a sad point of view. We actually think we can do whatever we want and then still get God's blessings. And you go, really? As a Hayden kid, that didn't even work with my mother. Okay? You violate what she tells you to do. You did not get blessed. You might have got whipped with a stick, but you did not get blessed. Unless you really are into kindling on your backside, as a blessing. But you get the idea. Okay. So you kind of get the idea. 3 times Joshua raises the same subject matter and just goes through it and through it and through it. He's trying to drive home the absolute necessity to be on guard against idolatry, against compromise with other peoples and their cultures because of religion. This should not surprise us on this side of the cross. Okay? You go to Corinthians, you find, come ye out from amongst them and be ye separate. Okay? Again, not isolated, but separate. There's mixed marriages in the New Testament have nothing to do with black and whites or green and yellows or polka dots versus stripes. It had a whole lot to do about believers marrying non-believers. And that's the ultimate spiritual mixed marriage. And usually they don't work out well. In any case, there's a whole lot of baggage that comes with them and a whole lot of struggling. There really is at the very, and that's when the nice things happen. Okay, chapter 24. The swan song, right? Most of us are familiar with verse 15. It's scattered on decals and what, decoupage, I guess, right? Decoupage on all kinds of wooden things all over people's walls for generation. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But I'll just point out some things as we zip on through it. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads, for their judges, for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Now, is this the same thing as in chapter 23? We don't know for sure. Some people say yes, some people say no. This was a second meeting, probably was a second meeting, not too long after that. Joshua is in failing health. One more time, he wants to get the point across to the nation, and he calls together all the leaders. Joshua, there in verse 2, said to all of the people, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, your fathers," now he's quoting God from here on. "Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in the old times, Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." Oops. Okay. He said, "I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood." Verse 4, "I gave to Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. I gave to Esau Mount Seir." Verse 5, "I sent Moses also and Aaron. I plagued Egypt." You kind of getting the idea on that personal pronoun? Keep going. I think it's mentioned like, 18 times down through until you get down to about, I don't know where it is. I scroll, verse 13, I guess. He says, "This is what I did. I brought you out." Verse 6, "I brought your fathers out of Egypt." This is kind of a history lesson. Joshua is reminding them, just like he did in the previous chapter, but now he's getting more specific of everything that God had done for the nation of Israel. That this was God's power at work. This was God accomplishing these things. And so you got that first person pronoun there. Verse 7 down towards the middle. "What I have done in Egypt." Verse 8, "I brought you into the land of the Amorites. I gave them into your hand. I destroyed them from before you." Verse 10, "I would not hearken to Balaam." He said, "I delivered you out of his hand." Verse 11, it's got at the end, after talking about the Perizzites, Hittites, Hivites, all those other people, he said, "I delivered them into your hand." Verse 12, "I sent the hornet before you." Now, is that a literal hornet? Possibly. Could have included that. Is it symbological for God's presence, bringing fear? And remember what it was at Jericho? The people inside the city were scared spitless when they saw the nation of Israel right across the river because they could remember the plagues in Egypt and the Exodus and everything that went with it. And they said, "There's no way we can, if their God is still fighting for them, we're toast." So over and over you have this that's here. Verse 13, "I have given you a land for which you did not labor." Now, see, from the human perspective, they had to fight for it. And God said, no, you misunderstand how this works. Okay? From the eternal and spiritual perspective, I gave it all to you because I gave you the ability to take it. You still have to do your part, but I gave you the part to do, and I gave you the ability to do the part. So quit bragging, because I did it all. Okay, that's the whole idea. So in verse 14, it says, "Now therefore," Joshua is no longer quoting God. Okay, and if I remember right, there's 18 I's in there, in that little text, that all talk about God doing for Israel. Okay. In verse 14, Joshua goes back and says, "Now therefore, fear the Lord." I love this because American evangelicalism has no fear of God whatsoever. You know, God's the big buddy. God's the guy who hands out candy canes at the county fair. God, runs the foo-foo booth where they have the cotton candy. God is their friend. God is the one who, fixes their flat tire for them, or writes the next stimulus check or whatever it happens to be. But they have no reverence of God. They have no fear of God. You're only talking about the pre-existent, all-powerful, omni-everything, God of the universe. He's not, I would suggest it's not probably the best thing to see him as your buddy, as your pal, as the big guy upstairs who's there whenever you need a hand. Joshua says, fear God. He just comes right out and says, now therefore, after recounting all of the power of God, fear him, serve him in sincerity and in truth, put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. Joshua apparently still has a great concern that there is idolatry even then floating around inside of Israel. Okay? You guys, at different times, Israel did pretty good. They called out and got all the idolatrous stuff and had it buried or burnt or thrown in the sea or whatever, in different events. But Joshua doesn't seem totally convinced that they've got this down pat as far as a serving commitment, as far as a true, genuine commitment level. Okay? Serve the Lord. If it seems evil to you today to choose to serve God, then choose who you will serve. Whether the gods your fathers served. Now all of a sudden you've got from the eye of what God had done for them, now all of a sudden you've got a real emphasis on serve, don't you? Okay? It's choose, serve. Verse 15, serve you the Lord, whom you will serve. The gods that your fathers served on the other side of the flood, the gods of the Amorites. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Verse 16, in the middle of it, forsaking the Lord to serve other gods. A little further down in verse 17, it talks about preserved us in the day wherein we went, talking about their service. Verse 18, we will serve the Lord, he is our God. You have people responding here. Verses 16 and following, Joshua makes it very clear he and his household are going to follow God. They're going to fear God. They're going to serve God. Notice the fear and the serving going together there. It's a whole subject in itself. The people answer in verse 16 through 18 and give a very positive answer. And they answer and said, God forbid, we will never forsake. We will not this, we will not that. But we already know they did. It was only a few decades later, after Joshua's death, that part of the nation is off chasing idolatrous stuff already. And God takes them into bondage. Joshua, you get the idea here, this is not his first rodeo. Because in verse 19, Joshua said to them, now maybe that was just an emotional, we're going to serve God faithfully thing. Okay? Knee-jerk response. After all, sometimes people tell people what they think the other people want to hear. Right? Joshua is not buying into it hook, line, and sinker. And he says, you can't serve the Lord, for he's holy. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions. If you forsake the Lord and serve strange gods, he will turn you to hurt. He'll consume you. Even though for now he's doing you good. He said that situation can change. And verse 21, the people said to Joshua, oh, no, we'll serve the Lord. Yeah. Man, if I took an exit poll on most Sunday mornings as people went out the door, they'd be all fired up about the spiritual this and how they need to that and everything else, And by Tuesday afternoon, they're in a dumpster someplace, spiritually. Not everybody, but you get the idea. Okay, it's tongue in cheek, and maybe it's extremism as an illustration, but you do get the idea. It's not the knee-jerk emotional response to the moment that Joshua is looking for. He wants to get it through to these people that this is a serious, genuine, lifetime commitment that is going on here. They come right back and said, no, we're going to serve the Lord. Verse 22, and Joshua says the third time, he says, I'm not sure you got it the second time. I'm going to, he's challenging them. He says, you are witnesses against yourselves. You have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we're witnesses. And we're witnesses. So he says, put away your strange gods. Incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. And Joshua says, 3 times is enough. If I haven't got through to them by now, I am wasting my time here. And preachers feel this way at times. They really do. Of course, somebody has to preach to them too, so they're as bad as everybody else. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, set them a statute as an ordinance in Shechem. Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone will be a witness to us, for it has heard the words of the Lord which he spoke. It will be therefore a witness to you, lest you deny your God. And Joshua let the people depart and sent them all home. Okay? You have 3 times through type of thing, don't you? When you kind of take a look at it. Joshua is bringing this charge repeatedly. And he said, I'm not sure they got it the first time. Seemed like just kind of a spontaneous emotional response. Yeah, we will. And Joshua comes back and says, no, I'm going to take you through it again so that you really get a grasp of what's going on. The people said, yes, we will serve. And Joshua says, I better hit them at least one more time to make sure they got the point. Teaching by repetition. Anybody that's ever done any teaching, that's almost an absolute have to, because nobody gets it the first time through. We pay lip service to it. Israel, unfortunately, did not do a grand job of following through with it. So you kind of get the idea. And what you have here, if you go clear back at the beginning of the chapter, in verse 2, Joshua said to the people, a lengthy thing, including the I part that I've already emphasized. In verse 19, it says, Joshua said to the people, okay? Second discourse, okay? In verse 27, and even shorter, each one of them gets shorter, is, and Joshua said to the people. 3 times he charges them with the same thing. Once it's long, next time it's kind of middle-sized, and the next time it's pretty short. He's trying to drive it home. So it comes to pass, after these things, that Joshua the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. You gotta love that. Not the dying at 110, but the servant of the Lord part. Remember what God wanted when he went and talked to Joshua, clear back in chapter 1, all those years before, and which could very well have been somewhere between 70 and 90 years. Okay? He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. I'm looking for a replacement. You want the job? I'm not looking for a big shot. I'm not looking for a giant intellect. I'm not looking for a great economic leader, military leader, or anything else. I'm looking for a servant. You want the job? Pretty good epitaph. The servant of the Lord. Okay? Now, if you're going to have something written on your tombstone, you might think about that somewhere, if you think it fits. The servant of the Lord. Okay? Now, this is kind of interesting because you have in this last 2 or 3 verses here, you have 3 burials. Yeah. You got 3 funerals that are recorded here for all practical purposes. Verse 30, they buried Joshua in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-serah, which is in the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gash. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. This is repeated in Judges, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. And then there's a second burial, the bones of Joseph. And you think, wow, this is a little odd at the end of this book. But you remember what Joseph had done. He said, this isn't my resting place. My bones belong in the promised land. And so he had given instruction. This is centuries before they had embalmed Joseph after he died in Egypt, and they had been lugging his bones around now for what amounted to centuries. And brought his bones. It says that they brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. I don't know what significance that has. And it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. And then there is, even perhaps a little bit more strangely, there's Eleazar, the son of Aaron. Aaron, remember, was the first high priest under the Mosaic covenant for the Jewish nation. Eleazar is his son. The son of Aaron died, and they buried him in a hill that pertained to Phinehas, his son, which was given him in the mount of Ephraim. You think, wow. You know, these were men that had all walked with God in service to God, and they understood that inheritance aspect of God giving the promised land to Israel. Even Joseph, that was way back then, Aaron, you know, and of course his son Eleazar, very much so, and of course Joshua himself had fought physically to be able to gain the promised land. Kind of interesting when you think these are men that had understood the promises of God concerning the promised land. And they wanted, you know, their bones interred in the land. You stop and think, well, why would this be mentioned? They say, well, I can't come up with a better reason for you. These are men that this was serious for them. Okay? They identified with the land. This was what God had promised. This was the promised land. And they identified with that, and they wanted, even in their deaths, they wanted a testimony of their commitment to the Lord. So there you have the book of Joshua. Boom, off we go. Let's have a word of prayer, and then maybe if you've got a comment or two, and then we'll go eat Krista's cake. Father, thank you for this time in your word. Lord, fantastic life that is recorded, that started out as a young man spying across the border at Kadesh Barnea. And we see that the young man had come out of Egypt and out through the parting of the Red Sea, had understood the pharaohs and the politics, and had from that developed under the tutelage of Moses on a human basis into the next great leader of the Jewish nation, the one that led that people into the promised land. What an amazing thing to see his life unfold and the different events that he was part of. And then the inheritance, his identification with the land was important to him because that is significant in the relationship between the God of Israel and the land and the people of Israel. So we thank you for that as we finish this book. May it honor you in Christ's name. Amen.